Okay.
Did you
All
hear
right.
that motorbike go past?
No, I did not. No. So I think we're good.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. Okay. So hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of Book Cafe Podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking about the book entitled "Jumbled Up in Jerusalem." And I'm extremely pleased to have the author himself in today's episode to talk about the book. But just before that, if you are watching this episode on YouTube, please be sure to put a like and subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. It really helps us out. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, do please continue to download and support the show because we are going to have new content added very soon. And in fact, it's fair to say that we have new content added all the time. But as far as this episode goes, let me first do my due diligence by welcoming the author himself, Mr. Julian Bond. So, hi, Julian. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Book Cafe Podcast.
Hi, walaikum salam. Good to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julian, for coming on to the show. And I have to make a confession right at the outset that we do know each other for a very long time now. We've been friends on Facebook for close to 13, 14 years, if I'm not mistaken. And we've obviously interacted a lot. But I think this is probably the first time we're actually having a discussion like this, online. And so I hope that this I am really looking forward to recording this episode with you. I'm sure that it's going to be really edifying and useful for our audience. So, Julian, before we get to your book, as a fan of your work and everything that you've done over the years, I know exactly who you are. But for our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book yet and who might be discovering you for the very first time, do please take this moment to tell us a little bit more about yourself. Specifically, I'm really interested to know more about your cultural and ethnic and religious background, where you grew up, what you do for a living, and in fact, anything at all that you'd like to share with us. So do please go ahead.
Okay, born in Wales, which is part of the United Kingdom. I don't know if any of your viewers might have seen Gavin and Stacey on BBC Bangladesh. It's possible. That's based in my hometown, so have a look out for it.
Yeah.
Went to school, studied RE amongst other topics, and then went on to do Christian theology at Christian Theological College, which is Wales, Aberystwyth, and lots of my friends were training for the ministry in the Presbyterian Church. Uh, I wasn't, but I was very influenced by quite strict Protestant theology. Then I went and worked for the civil service. I worked in Customs and Excise, Inland Revenue, later HM Rev. So that's tax and customs authorities. But then had an opportunity to go on secondment to the Archbishop of Canterbury's Christian Muslim Initiative for 2 years. And in that, I became the first director of the Christian Muslim Forum, which is a national charity for England, because it came out of the Church of England, to bring Christians and Muslims closer, understanding, campaigning, research, church and mosque twinning, leadership development. We had a special women's leadership development program and did some interesting campaigns around Eid and Christmas and racism and bigotry, Islamophobia. I was very active in churches in the United Reformed Church and the Methodist Church, where I was an elder or a steward. I would preach from time to time and share preaching in Sunday morning services with a friend who was an official preacher. I was sort of rogue preacher. And I always had an interest in theological reading, having finished my degree. So I did a lot of reading around the historical Jesus, which I think might be one of your questions later, and studying biblical texts and a little bit around the interaction between Judaism and Christianity, but then eventually getting into Islam. I read this and then that set me off on a journey which ultimately led to the Christian Muslim Forum.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Julian. And yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, I did actually get in touch with you because you had a Facebook page or a group entitled the Christian Muslim Forum. And I remember that about 10, 12 years back, when Facebook was still a novelty, there was a lot of interaction online between Christians and Muslims the world over. And we were all looking for a platform or a platform to initiate dialogue with one another. And I can remember that the Christian Muslim Forum was one of those Facebook groups where the interaction was always so cordial. And I must say that you always managed it really well. So there was never anybody overstepping the mark or being rude with each other. It was such a cordial society, cordial community that I personally had a lot of fun and I learned a lot, mixing and mingling with people of different faith groups. So yes, kudos to you for managing not just as director of the Christian Muslim Forum, but also managing all of us online and and making sure that we're all in harmony with one another. So yes, it really I really do take off my hat to you for that. So, coming to the book
Thank you.
itself, Julian, yeah, absolutely. And coming to the book itself, Julian, it's called Jumbled Up in Jerusalem. And if I may say so, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners will be very familiar with the city of Jerusalem. It's a holy city. It's a holy site for three great monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But what exactly went behind the ideation of of the name itself? Why is it called Jumbled Up in Jerusalem? And what exactly is the book about? If you could just help us understand that.
It was just a fairly straightforward, plain modern language paraphrase or rephrasing of Mark's gospel. But then I had ideas of doing more with it, which involved being more adventurous and adding in extra bits of story, particularly sort of time traveling me and Jesus in Israel, Palestine, and in London.
Hmm.
So fictional and probably influenced by all those time travel bits from Star Trek, which I was a big fan of.
Oh wow. Well,
And uh, it's it started with the very bland title, Jesus, Our Role Model. But it was once I started jumbling in other bits, interesting
hmm,
title, and I started out with Jumbled, and then obviously Jerusalem
hmm.
bumped into that, so that's how it ended up like that.
Okay. Well, I have to say that it was quite the apt title. And, if I may say so, when I first started reading it, I was actually very puzzled as to where to fit this genre. I couldn't make up my mind as to whether was this meant to be a parody, was this social commentary, was this fiction, nonfiction, or was it a combination of everything? And like you rightly said, you started out as something about rewriting Mark's gospel. And in fact, I should say that I initially thought it was a rewriting of John's gospel, but because it started with John the Baptist. But yes, I do stand corrected that eventually, by the time I finished reading the entire book, I did come to that realization that yes, it was actually a retelling of Mark's gospel. And of course, the fact that she even threw in the time traveling bit and having that inspiration from Star Trek. So it really was a wonderful treat. It was an amazing read, and I just cannot praise it enough. But since you mentioned Star Trek, Julian, can I just very quickly ask who was your favorite character from that franchise? Who was your favorite Star Trek character?
Obviously Captain Kirk, but with Spock a very, very close second.
Okay, awesome. Well, truth be told, I actually have Mr. Spock as my best character, my favorite character from the original series, and of course, in the next generation, it's probably Data and maybe uh, Jean-Luc Picard comes a close second. But truth be told, I'm actually just about to start reading a book by William Shatner. It's his autobiography, so I'm really looking forward to reading that. But I digress. So let's come back to Jumbled Up in Jerusalem. If I can ask, Julian, how long did it actually take you to write the entire book? I believe that it came out in 2016. But how far back did you start writing the project, or was it a very short? term
Yeah.
that it took to finish it. So if you could help us
I
understand.
think I first started writing it in 2014 and then posted it on medium.com, continued tweaking the main document, so Word documents, until about 2018. Haven't really done anything with it
Mhm.
since then. I was hoping to get a bit more reader feedback in the publishing industry. I have friends who work for publishers or write books, but haven't had as much feedback from professionals as I would have liked. And I'm thinking how it might evolve in the future if I go back to doing some more work on it. And effectively, I wrote it twice because I started out with a more straight account and then wrote lots of extra bits and started scurrying around the other three gospels to find bits that would be interesting to include in a whole story.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so as you rightly said, and I should point this out to our viewers and listeners, our audience, that it is currently available on the Medium platform, and we do hope that the book gets picked up by a publisher, and I hope that they'll be willing to get this out to the entire world. But for now, we will, those of us who are on the Medium platform, we will get to enjoy it. And I really encourage everybody else here to also get on the same platform and have a read, because it really is a fascinating read at that. So Julian, let me just come to another question that initially, when, as I said, that truth be told, when I first started reading it, I was trying to make sense of it, as to what exactly was the entire purpose of the book. And in fact, you did actually answer this question right at the end, in a chapter called the Outroduction, which I had actually initially missed because I
Mm.
thought that it's the book actually finished one chapter before. But you did answer that. But just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, would you mind just recapping the raison d'etre of the book? Why did you write this book, or why did you rewrite the Gospel of Mark in the first place? So if you could help us understand that.
Yeah, originally it came out of a group therapy session where I was making a complaint that someone was using casual blasphemy and saying in a conversation. And then they asked me why that bothered me. And we talk in the group about doing homework. So I was given some homework to go away, read the Gospels, and Jesus was, what he was like, what his characteristics were, how he interacted with people, what kind of emotions he had. This was personal development work. So I picked up Mark's Gospel because it's short, it's chapters. You can
Mhm.
read it really quickly,
Right.
and came up with a whole list of things about Jesus: passionate, loving, gentle, kind, angry,
Mhm.
possibly intolerant in places, caring, etc., etc. There's about 40 odd different descriptions, and I think when I first started getting into the writing project that came out of that, there were different sections around these themes, and it had sort of Bible study notes to go with it.
Mhm.
Um, but then I really got into the story. And the point of getting into of going back to the story was to meet the man.
Mhm.
So Jesus Christ, Son of God, Messiah, Christ, second person of the Trinity within the Christian tradition, all these different descriptions. So burdens from my perspective with a massive weight of theology.
Mhm.
And that question whether we've lost sight of the man because of all of that, and notwithstanding all those beliefs, as a real Jewish man 2,000 years ago who interacted with the people, had completely human experiences, was born and was died. Sorry, was born and died.
Mhm.
And I think I've been partly influenced by, through my interfaith work, the interest in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And I read Martin Ling's biography, which is a classic.
Yeah.
So that focus on the life of the prophets in Christianity, we have four gospels,
Mhm.
but not so much focus on the man. So there's descriptions in the Islamic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad's got on with his neighbors or how his neighbors didn't get on with him, how he reacted to people who were rude or visited them when they were ill or took note of them when um, there was fun or when people were causing a disruption in his masjid in Medina, and all these stories and all the sunnah. So how he ate, what he wore, how he ran his household, how he played with his daughter, Fatima on his back as he was doing his prayers, for example, um, all kinds of things, which we don't have in Christian tradition. So in the Gospels, we don't know anything about the physical characteristics of Jesus other than he was a Jewish man. We don't know anything about his height, his skin tone, the color of his eyes, the color of his hair. And we can make some good, although lots of people in the West seem to think he was blonde and had
Right.
white skin. There we go.
Right.
So it was getting back in touch with that, and it was a story. Let's get back to the story. And I think that was another thing that came from interfaith, telling stories. So people sitting around telling stories of the prophet, and then I was able on various stories that Jesus told and share those with Muslim groups. So on one occasion, as an interfaith event, I told a large group of imams the story of the Good Samaritan, and then applied it as Samaritans were distrusted by the Jews. Muslims are distrusted by a significant proportion of English people because of the media and other things.
Okay. Absolutely. And yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that, Julian, because you in fact preempted one of my next questions, but I want to just dwell on this for a little bit. I think it was actually Dr. Bart Ehrman, the really a very well-known New Testament critical historical scholar, who once said that Christianity is not so much the religion of Jesus as it is a religion about Jesus. And so, what you're saying is that it was your interaction with Muslims and the way that Muslims tend to, highlight the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which actually was one of your motivations to try and deep dive a little bit into the life of Jesus, the man himself, rather than just looking at the theology which surrounds Jesus. So I think that's a wonderful, I mean that's really something that I really appreciate you saying, and because that actually leads into my next question, which is, at this point in time, there's a lot of critical historical studies. Biblical historical studies, of course, have been going on for a very long time. But now we've also reached a stage where even the Quranic studies are also, being looked at by critical historical scholars. So, what matters to you at this point in time, Julian? Are you more interested in knowing more about the historical Jesus and the historical Muhammad, as opposed to just the Christ of faith and the Muhammad of faith? What is more important to you, or are they both equally important? So, if you could just help us understand.
I think they're completely intertwined.
Right.
And I was very, very interested in Jesus' question, which is still waiting for an answer, I think.
Mhm.
And I think that comes through in Jumbled Up in Jerusalem.
Right.
Whole question of the Christ of faith, that's something almost completely different, but really difficult to um, find a clear line because it's just one piece.
Mhm.
Uh, and I wonder about this Muhammad of faith or Muhammad of history. So had some very interesting presentations about the Prophet Muhammad as see as being the sort of embodiment of divine and of being not created but pre-existent before Adam was created in the Islamic tradition. So Muhammad is the archetypal man, the perfect man, Insan Kamil.
Hmm. Right.
and um, and we crash into the bumping into difficult hadiths or probably dodgy hadiths,
Right.
and it's worth pointing out that the Quran itself doesn't say a great deal about the Prophet Muhammad. There's the interaction with him, and God is speaking to Muhammad in the narrative or the recitation,
Mhm.
and there's snippets from the life of some of the revelations are related to events from his life. I was reading one recently about Zayd, his nephew,
Yeah,
son-in-law,
his
something like that,
one
adopted
Zayd,
son.
exactly, adopted son, his scribe. Zayd ibn Thabit
Yeah,
was his scribe, and Zayd ibn Hariya was his adopted son. So there were two Zayds, basically. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, yeah. Please go ahead.
And I I think although these two questions, these two ends of the spectrum, perhaps on critical scholarly world, I think believers do need to engage with it and
Mm,
understand what that's about, and I suppose make up their own minds and consider what it means to talk about what does it mean to talk about the Christ of faith to someone who doesn't believe, or the Mohammed of faith to someone who doesn't believe. It just doesn't compute.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that that's also really well said, Julian. You know, we have to have a balance between the faith tradition as well as the critical historical studies. And I completely agree with you that the critical historical studies, if it can help to shed light on the historical Jesus and the historical Muhammad, then by all means, every believing Muslim and Christian should wholeheartedly embrace it because it is helping us to shed light on something that may have been, colored a bit more with all the religious trappings and the pious history. And so I think that this is just another tool to help us, get at look into the past or a window into the past, if I may say so. But just coming back to your book, Julian, there are a couple of questions that I have to ask you specifically with regards to the book. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing justice to our viewers and listeners because we are, after all, talking mostly about Jumbled Up in Jerusalem. So, one of the questions that I have for you is with regards to something that you mentioned in one of the chapters, and I'll just read it out to you verbatim. You wrote that in his day, he, meaning Jesus, was more popular than the Beatles. So I have to ask you: is this is this a pushback against the famous John Lennon and what he had said during the height of Beatlemania that they were more popular than Jesus? So is this a pushback to John Lennon and what he said? So if you could help us understand that.
It's not quite pushback. It's just a bit of fun because that was what they said. They were mobbed by the crowds,
Right.
reading through the Gospels, and one of my friends who read it, I was really struck by the crowds turning up all the time, and he couldn't escape from them. And they'd followed him all around the Sea of Galilee, the lake, and they were there waiting for him. And he'd go off up a mountain to escape from them. And it says that he couldn't do things because people were everywhere.
Mhm.
So celebrity is a difficult thing. I mean, it's nice to be a celebrity, I guess, but then it has comes with all kinds of challenges. So there's some in that bit that you quoted. I think it goes on to give some reflections about celebrity.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and of course, I do hope that the all the Lennon fans that are out there are not going to mind having a bit of fun with this because it is, of course, a wonderful play on words, and I'm glad that I was glad to read about that in the book because I also am a fan of the Beatles and I really respect their music. And in fact, I should just point out here to our viewers and listeners outside of Bangladesh that George Harrison, of course, we in Bangladesh are extremely indebted to him for actually popularizing the support for Bangladesh in August 1971 when he held the concert for Bangladesh, and he had all his musician friends including Eric Clapton and a whole bunch of other well-known musicians, as well as the Indian maestro Ravi Shankar. And so I think that was a turning point in the war as far as the popular opinion goes. So it was very skewed towards the Pakistani side, but then after that concert, and of course we have George Harrison and the ex-Beatle, the late Beatle, to thank for that. So yeah, so so I hope that helps to mitigate some of
Yeah.
the angry comments that we might get from Lennon fans. But yeah, but so I have another question, Julian, and this is something which I was trying to make a sense of in the book, but now that I have you right in front of me, so I think that I would love to get the answer straight from you, and that is to do with Jesus cursing the fig tree. Okay, and of course, you mentioned in the
Okay.
beginning that you picked the Gospel of Mark because it was the shortest gospel. It's only 16 chapters. But also, the second reason which you gave is that it is a more humane picture of Jesus. It's not a sanitized version of Jesus like what we might get in the Gospel of Luke, for example. And so, Jesus cursing the fig tree, is something that is something that we need to ponder about because it wasn't the season for figs. But you had a very interesting commentary which you wrote in the book, which is, and I'll just read it to you verbatim. You wrote that the fig tree story is a parable about how people can answer their own prayers depending on their karma. Can you help us understand what you meant by this entire phrase, this whole sentence? Please do go ahead. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because I spent a lot of time puzzling over that story, and then I wrote that, and I'm not entirely sure what I meant when I wrote it. But yeah, so I think not taking it literally is helpful, and that would make it a parable. And it is about sort of about prayer because Jesus talks about asking for things and having them granted. And here's an example where he saw something, he said something, uh, what he said, and then his followers remark on it. So it was like it was a lesson, sign, an example to them, and it either strengthened their faith or challenged their faith. While as I was writing and thinking,
Hmm.
I think that
Okay.
happens.
Okay, all right, okay. So yeah, fair enough. Okay, so we'll take your answer as it is, and I have to say that when I read that, I was contemplating whether you were alluding to something like panentheism, but I was wondering if you would even go that far, to take it one step further from monotheism into something else. But yeah, I think that it's a huge discussion, and it's really something that also got me thinking. But I'd love to return to it maybe offline. We can have that discussion. But I really need to move on to another question, Julian, again from the book, and so this one is with regards to when Jesus was up on the cross, and of course, he, cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And of course, the people who were listening to him assumed that maybe he was calling out for Elijah. And so, can you help me understand, just as a student of religion, but maybe I couldn't really comprehend it the first time I read it, but what was the significance of Elijah in the biblical story, in the story of Jesus, and why was
Right, okay.
Elijah, uh, you know, uh, uh, why was Elijah predicted to come back before the Messiah? So if you could help us understand that a bit.
Right, okay. Yeah, so Elijah appears in the biblical book of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings.
Hmm.
Uh, and figure, he appears from nowhere, basically.
Right.
And then at the end of his life, he's whisked off to heaven by God.
Yeah.
And his main disciple, Elisha, standing there with his cloak, looking at him disappear. So within the Jewish tradition, there's this expectation that Elijah will return, I think connected to the Messiah. I'm not a massive student of Judaism, but at Passover, a chair is left empty for Elijah at
Hmm.
the table when the Jewish family is celebrating Passover. And in the Gospels, there's a number of times. Who are you? Are you the prophet? Are you Elijah returned? And Jesus is asked in the story, and he refers to John the Baptist as Elijah, or as an Elijah-like figure, or as someone who is representing Elijah in some ways. And some people would take that literally, and John the Baptist as being Elijah returned.
Mhm.
And there's this whole thing about the sidekick. So Elijah had Elisha, Jesus had John the Baptist, and there's this Elijah link in the middle of it.
Mhm. Understood. Absolutely. And Julian, I think that you might be the right person for me to ask a tangential question. And obviously, it's not in the book, but it's just out of curiosity that I think I could probably ask you this. And that is, so as per what you've just told me, so John the Baptist is Elijah, as per what Jesus said in the Gospel of John, and Jesus himself is the Messiah. But the Jews at the time had asked John the Baptist three questions: Are you the Messiah? Are you Elijah? Or are you the prophet? And so that kind of makes me feel that they were waiting for three distinct figures, and we've accounted for two of them, which is John the Baptist and Jesus. And the prophet that they were waiting for at the time that John the Baptist had made his appearance, if you take a look at the footnotes in the Gospel of John, it actually references Deuteronomy 18:18, where God is
Yes.
speaking to Moses and says that I will raise up a prophet for you people from amongst your brothers, the Ishmaelites. And so, so do you feel, as a religious pluralist and as somebody who has, you know, had so many interfaith discussions between Christians and Muslims, could this be an allusion to the Prophet Muhammad by any chance? What would be your opinion on that?
I'm very familiar with it from Islamic materials, but I would say no. Um, there's all the sort of speculation around it being from brothers or kin, and therefore not the Jewish community themselves. But I think it is referring to the Jewish community. I think the context of that chapter is that it's saying after Moses has gone, there will be other prophets, and maybe it just uses the example of one in the account, recognizing a true prophet, that if they speak what they claim are the words of God, if they come true, if they're actualized, then you know they're a true prophet, and if not, then they're a false prophet. So it's a however, I think Christians kicked this one off by saying, Deuteronomy Deuteronomy 18 is talking about Jesus. I don't think it's talking about Jesus either, because what we're doing is we're standing later, maybe on a mountaintop, looking down, and we're seeing ourselves, our own religious figures, our own religious beginnings there, and they're not there. Separate religious traditions, and they subvert the previous ones. Christianity subverts Judaism, and I'm not making a judge. This is more of a description than anything. Islam, Christianity. It comes along and says, okay, you're sort of mostly there, but you're not quite right. And we're going to straighten it out, and we're going to explain some previous scriptures to you. And we're going to give you a whole different context to be looking at. That's not where it starts. That's what it looks like when you look backwards. I could get into all kinds of arguments about that one.
Okay, all right, yeah,
I actually
yes,
wrote a long blog on medium.com about the paraclete in John 14, because
right,
I think I had an argument with someone on Twitter who was saying, oh, yes, when Jesus is talking about the advocate or the counselor in John 14, this is the Prophet Muhammad. And I said, no, it's not. And I wrote this long thing explaining with the context, because you have a chunk of text and suddenly you've got the Prophet Muhammad in the middle about all the other bits around it, which
right.
is a question you always have when you're looking at text.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I think that yeah, that's really well said because the there well, I think like if I may say so that 15, 20 years back when the discussions were more polemical in nature, it was always each side would bring in their arguments and it was sort of like may the best argument win. But I think at this in this day and age, Julian, I have to confess that I've gone so way past the polemical bits of it that for me, as a historian, as a lay historian, I'm more interested in seeing how all these traditions link up together, and we have to acknowledge that Islam should not be seen divorced from the Judeo-Christian traditions that it comes from and is a part of. And so we do ourselves a disservice if there are still people out there who are trying to win polemical points. And so, it's much better to put our heads together and try and figure everything out together and see, where we go from there. So yes, I think that's really well said that we can try and look at it all together and see. Okay, so finally, Julian, at this point, normally what happens is that I usually spring a surprise guest question for my interviewee. But unfortunately, I have to apologize that Dr. Craig Considine, whom I actually tried reaching out to, uh, uh, is probably busy with another project, and so I didn't get a chance to get a reply from him yet. But you were very gracious in sending in a question for his episode. And of course, for our viewers and listeners who have been with us for a while now, would know that Dr. Considine is the author of the book, The Humanity of Muhammad, The Christian View. And he recorded an episode with us, and he's been really good to the show. And so, if I could put the same question that you gave him to you, Julian, what would be your answer to this particular question? If Jesus and Muhammad had met, what would they say to each other? So, what would be your response to that?
Uh, I think I touched on this in a talk I gave at a London Dialogue event, and I think I sent it to you, and that's on medium.com somewhere. When Jesus met Muhammad, I think basically they're together and say, "Look what our followers did, and look how they took our original message and turned into something quite different, and how they all divided from each other because Prophet Muhammad were like not like that. So Jesus was a Jew. He didn't invent Christianity. He didn't start a new religion. Um, and likewise, I don't think the Prophet Muhammad did either. It was calling people to faith, but it was obviously depends on how you read the Quranic text. It was inclusive of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians and who knows who else. That was the essence of it. But the followers, they put the essence to one side and then hmm, they go to the extremes. The being the people of the middle way is one of the first things I learned about Islam, but sometimes you wouldn't think that that is how it's supposed to be.
Mhm. Absolutely. And
Um, I think they would find themselves in agreement on many things.
yes, yes, absolutely, and definitely for sure, and as you rightly said, the middle way, the middle path, the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the rightly balanced nation. So yes, and I think that that actually explains why, Julian, that all the work that you have done over the years is so important because it's not just religious tolerance; it is pluralism and active engagement, which you have virtually lived for the throughout your entire career. And I think that it is kudos to you and all the great work that you have done in the past with Christian Muslim Forum and what you continue to do and living each day that pluralistic worldview and that active engagement between different faith communities and bringing the world together is something that is extremely admirable. And I hope that all our viewers and listeners who are watching this or listening to this episode will take away. Excuse me. And so finally,
Yeah.
Julian, if I can just ask you one last question about the book. What is the one central message that you want anybody who reads it to come away with? What would be the one single message that you hope that anybody who reads the book comes away with?
Yeah, just want people to read it, meet Jesus as a real person, and make up their own minds about him.
Absolutely, absolutely, and why not? So I think that's really well
And
said. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, okay.
and be open-minded.
And be open-minded. Yeah, absolutely. And so that once again alludes to the pluralism that we just spoke about. Okay, so with that in mind, Julian, so I've pretty much exhausted all of my questions with regards to the book, but I do have some staple questions which we love to ask during every episode. And so very quickly, I'll just ask you a couple of them. Because we are a podcast about books and it's in the title, so I definitely have to ask you this: that are you more of a nonfiction guy or are you more of a fiction person? So, what genre of books do you enjoy reading the most? I think you already alluded to it with regards to science fiction, right? With Star
Yeah,
Trek. So,
non-fiction.
sorry, come again?
Oh, yeah. When I was young, I used to mainly read non-fiction. So here's one I'm just.
Okay, Robot Souls. Okay,
But I've also got this one.
okay. Oh wow,
It's an
that's
interesting
amazing.
book,
Okay,
which
so
I started
okay. And can you just read out the names
reading.
of the two books? Yeah, for listeners who are listening to this on who are just listening to the audio track. What would the
So
names of
this
the
is called
books?
Jesus the Magician. Right, okay. So this is called Jesus the Musician, the Magician.
Mhm,
This is Jesus and Historian's Review of the Gospels.
mhm,
And this is a very new book called Robot Souls. It only came out this month, and it's about the connection between the soul and AI, and whether whether AI needs more of a soul.
mhm.
And there's some kind of link. I don't think she was thinking about it with the new Mission Impossible film, which is about rogue AI trying to take over everything.
Wow, that sounds like a mind-blowing book, and I really will definitely have to put that on my bucket list. So yes, thank you so much for putting this out there. So the next question, Julian, I have for you is one of the more tougher questions I've been told allegedly by most of my guests, but I'd really like to throw this out to you because I think that you're one of the best people to ask. And the question is, if you could select a book that you feel that every, let's say, young person should read at least once in their lifetime, it may or may not be related to religious history or theology, but at least a book that is edifying or useful, what would be that one particular book that you feel that everybody should read at least once in their lifetime? So what would be your pick?
Well, I would encourage anyone to read the Quran or the Bible, and for people to read the one which is outside their own tradition if they can. I wish I'd had longer to think about this, and I thought about what I was reading when I was a youngster. I remember we all read The Hobbit
Right. The
when I was
Hobbit
in
trilogy.
junior school, and that was like a rite of passage because I think there were not that many copies. Have you read it yet? And The Hobbit rather than The Lord of the Rings, because The Lord of the Rings is much too long.
Mm, absolutely.
Um, so I read a lot of Star Trek books in the 70s, but I don't think I'd recommend those.
Okay, so you can do no wrong by recommending Tolkien because I think a lot of our viewers who are fans of the viewers and listeners who are fans of the fantasy genre would absolutely love that answer. So yeah, so we'll take it as we'll take The Hobbit as your answer for this particular question. I think that's a fantastic book to recommend. Okay, so on that note, for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. Once again, if you are watching this on YouTube, do please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. If you're listening to this on any of the podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, do please continue to download and support the show. And the book, once again, is Jumbled Up in Jerusalem. I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book written by a wonderful author. So be sure to get it and be sure to look for it online on the Medium platform. And hopefully it'll be out soon in paperback and hard copy as well. Julian, my thanks to you as well. Thank you so much for being on the show and for talking to me. I've always enjoyed my conversations with you in the past on Facebook and all the online platforms, and I really hope to continue to have future discussions with you. And by the way, do you have another writing project in the pipeline? If you do, could you tell us about it very quickly?
Oh, well, I don't know if you came across it when you were looking, but I wrote how to read the Quran.
Okay.
So a blog on each surah, each one dedicated to a different Muslim friend,
Hmm.
sometimes more than one. So dedicated to about 120 different people.
120 different people. Wow. That's amazing. So I'll definitely keep a lookout for that. No, I did not know about it, but thank you so much for telling me about it. And just one
Mm,
last thing very quickly, Julian. If your fans and your readers wanting to get in touch with you or keep up to date with your activities, what would be the best way to do so?
mm. Probably from Twitter, Julian Bond 12, and
Okay.
they can find links to various things that I've written on there as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we'll definitely have that in the description, and I would encourage everybody who's watching or listening to follow Julian and to be up to date on all his activities. So, Julian, thank you once again. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I really enjoyed myself, and I hope that it's been edifying for all of our viewers and listeners. And I really hope to have you back very soon as you have your next book published. So, thank you once again, and I wish you a happy weekend, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.